Today we're continuing our study of Friedrich Nietzsche's work, The Birth of Tragedy, his first major work. And what we're going to do today is go through sections 5 through 10, trying to look at Nietzsche's understanding of the development of Greek art, ultimately leading up to tragedy, not going all the way into late tragedy, so we're not going to actually talk about Euripides today. That's going to be in the next lecture when we talk about Euripides and Socrates. But the tragedy that's associated primarily with Aeschylus and Sophocles, which for Nietzsche is sort of the high point of Greek tragedy. So how do we get there? In the last lecture, we talked about these two different responses to the situation or problem of life. One of these is called the Dionysian, the other is called the Apollonian. These are named after Greek gods. Dionysus is the god of wine, intoxication. He was associated with mystery religions, fertility cults, losing oneself in a communal, tribal, ecstatic experience. Apollo is the god associated with the arts, so particularly with sculpture, the plastic arts, as they're called. And Nietzsche, he specifies, okay, these aren't the only gods, but this opposition is particularly important. And so in the last lecture, we looked at that opposition per se, and it's going to come up again in this lecture. Now we're more interested in how do these actually interact with each other? What is the interplay between them? And I put interplay in addition to opposition because these are not simply two opposed forces or responses or ways of life or descriptors. They can be at antipodes from each other, but sometimes they can actually fuse together. And that's what Nietzsche thinks is happening with this genre of poetry and music and art, which is called tragedy. So we want to look at how these two different forces, as Nietzsche has conceived of them, actually come into contact with each other and don't just provoke each other or push off of each other, but actually fuse into each other. We have to start with the reasons for Nietzsche, why tragedy became what it was. What it was, I say, too, not what it is, because Nietzsche doesn't think that there's some sort of eternal essence of tragedy floating around out there. He thinks that what counts as tragedy in this full sense is something that's actually, in some ways, a bit fragile. You get it sometimes and not at other times. It's worth thinking as well about how much of this applies to the artistic products of our own time, or experiences, you might say. Not the experience of the artist per se, but the experience of the consumer, the spectator, the audience, the participant. So we have to think about the reasons for these oppositions, for artistic responses, artistic participation, consumption. And here metaphysics and morals come together. If you remember in the last lecture, one of the points that I made very early on was that for Nietzsche, aesthetics, or the study of beauty, art, what are these things, morals, the study of what's right and wrong, what ought to be done, what's the good life, those sorts of things, and metaphysics, the study of what is ultimately real, what lies behind the appearances, what are the causes of things. All of these come together. And if you try to dissociate these from each other, as is often done by a lot of different philosophical schools, some of them just ignore some parts altogether, or they separate these out into different fields that have to be hermetically maintained at distances from each other so they don't contaminate each other. If you try to do that, Nietzsche thinks, you're actually falsifying the picture. The ultimate goal is to know reality. And reality is not something out there, totally value neutral, known without any sort of affective or aesthetic response on our part. Nor is it known just theoretically speculatively, abstractly. It's known through thinking, but it's also known through living. And it's known through living in contexts, in situations, in lives that are strung together. Well, that's part of what drama is going to replicate for us. So let's see how we get there. Before we do that, though, let's talk about this metaphysics that lies behind Nietzsche's project. What is life? For Nietzsche, you don't actually ask the question, what is reality, without asking the question, what is life? So you could conceive of a cosmos totally devoid of life. That would be totally uninteresting for Nietzsche. He's interested in how does life adapt itself? How does life assimilate things? What sense does it make out of the world in which it lives, its own, once it becomes self-conscious, its own place or purpose or existence in the world? And Nietzsche, is thinking in terms not of some grand origin story, beginning with physics or cosmology, but what is life lived with other people already in cultures that are imbued with certain structurings of value, seeing things in certain ways? What is life in striving, in responding to things, in taking on projects and seeing them through, in surviving, in making do? What is life about? So this is a very basic philosophical question. This is part of why Nietzsche is a first-rate philosopher, because he's beginning from a foundational issue. Is there something behind the appearances, behind all the phenomena, behind all the things that you could point to and describe? One way that Nietzsche wouldn't think of this, but which we could think of in our own time, let's say you paid somebody to follow you around with a camera, a video camera, all the time. We have some shows kind of like that, and we have some people who've done projects kind of like that, setting up webcams in their apartments and actually making money off of that. What would your life be like? Is it all those little moments put together, those interactions, the things that people can observe, or is there some sort of other underlying unity to your own life? Or, let's say we expand it. Now imagine these sort of cameras, and imagine that your mind is actually able to take in all this data and make sense of it. Is there something beyond all this data and information put together? Even if we organize it, systematize it. Is there something beyond that? Nietzsche says, yeah, there actually is. There's something beneath the appearances that we can become conscious of. And he talks about this in section 17, which we're actually not going to look at very much today, but I do want to quote a short passage from it. He talks about Dionysiac art, and he says that it wishes to convince us of the eternal delight of existence, but it insists that we look for this delight not in the phenomena, but behind them. It makes us realize that everything that is generated must be prepared to face its painful dissolution. So that's part of his message, that everything that exists is one step away or several steps away from falling into the void of nothingness. It forces us to gaze into what he calls the horror of individual existence. Nietzsche does think, at least at this point, life does not have any ultimate meaning in the sense of something predating life or structuring all life. In Nietzsche's view, you will die, I will die, and once we've died, there is no me anymore, there is no you anymore. There are memories of us, there are traces of us. Strictly speaking, there's no Friedrich Nietzsche anymore, except what has been externalized in his books and his thought. Nietzsche is committed to atheistic existentialism. So, the horror of individual existence, yet without being turned to stone by the vision. For a brief moment, he says, we become ourselves the primal being and we experience its insatiable hunger for existence. So this is very interesting. Nietzsche thinks that there is some sort of primal being greater than us, beyond what we are, And we are, in some ways, kind of extensions of this. There is a life that is greater than us, not necessarily some sort of Platonic conception of life, or what the Christians, Jews, Muslims would call God or anything like that. But life itself, as it's going on, is embodied in us. It's kind of a fairly Aristotelian understanding of the concept. But now notice, Nietzsche is not committed to something like a metaphysical monism, like you would find, say, in a lot of varieties of Hindu philosophy, or in, say, Benedict Spinoza. Instead, what's at the center of being? Hunger, conflict, as we'll see a little bit later on. Sort of a splitting, a jarring, becoming other. It almost sounds very Hegelian at this point. Actually, Nietzsche accuses himself of being dialectical or Hegelian about this book later on. What else does he say? Back in section 8, he talks about human beings being separated from each other and from nature. So he says that, let's see here. In fact, all that separated man from man, human beings from each other, gave way before an overwhelming sense of unity which led back into the heart of nature, that which we become alienated, estranged from. The metaphysical solace with which I wish to say at once all true tragedy sends us away, that despite every phenomenal change, life is at bottom indestructibly joyful and powerful, was expressed most concretely in the chorus of tragedy. So there is this metaphysical solace, a consolation, something saying, it's okay, it's not that bad, comforting, right? In a restoration of unity. Unity that's been lost. Here Nietzsche actually sounds like who? He sounds a lot like Rousseau, almost. But he's not going where Rousseau goes either. He's going on his own particular path. So despite every phenomenal change, life is indestructibly joyful and powerful. Does that mean my life is indestructibly joyful and powerful? No. But I can, you might say, reunite myself with this primal life that is such. Later on, he talks about desire reaching beyond the transcendental world. Not just the phenomenal world, but the transcendental world. That's pretty interesting. He says, now no comfort any longer avails. Desire reaches beyond the transcendental world, the world of values, the world of to some degree, abstractions, right? That which is supposed to lie beyond the appearances. So it goes, desire goes even beyond what lies beyond the appearances. Beyond the gods themselves and existence, together with its gulling reflection in the gods and an immortal beyond, is denied. So this is nihilism. Existence, any value to it whatsoever, is ultimately being said to be wrong. Even to say it's wrong is in a certain way to misconceive it. There's just nothing there. If you try to reach beyond existence itself to find a meaning in it, which is what our desire prompts us to do, you will find literally nothing. Because there's nothing else beyond existence, beyond what is. And he says, the truth once seen, man is is aware everywhere of the ghastly absurdity of existence. The ghastly absurdity. Existence is meaningless, senseless, ultimately, for Friedrich Nietzsche. This is why he is seen as a nihilistic philosopher, although in large respect, Nietzsche's work is an attempt to overcome nihilism. But he stares it straight in the face. And he says, yes, this is it. We have existence. You can probe deeper into it if you want to. You will never find anything that actually goes beyond existence, even though you can think of something like that, you can desire something like that, you can imagine something like that, and call it, say, God, or the gods, or truth, beauty, anything you like, any sort of transcendental value. But ultimately, it's all just here. And this is it. This is all you get. So he thinks that that has a danger for us. So I put all these different quotes on the board because these capture the two sides of this. On the one hand, you see him talking about delight or joy. You know, this sense of life itself swelling up, expanding itself, power, mastering things, taking happiness in that. On the other hand, he talks in terms of fear, terror, or sorrow. Speaks of a horror of individual existence, the ghastly absurdity of existence. He even talks in terms of nausea invading the person. So this is the substratum. This is the foundation of where Nietzsche is coming from. Now let's go back to this talk of the Apollonian and Dionysiac. And let's look at art. So, when Nietzsche is thinking about Greek art, he talks a little bit about sculpture. The main things that he talks about are music. Then even more important, at least in terms of the relative space given to it. Music is actually more important ontologically, metaphysically. But in terms of the space that he gives to it, it's poetry, speech. So he doesn't talk really in terms of painting, although the Greeks did do painting. They had other arts as well. Dance, he talks a little bit about dance, but he doesn't explore it very much. These are really the big things. Now notice, too, that quite often, when we're talking about the fine arts, we separate off drama as something distinct from what we might call literature. If you're today taking a poetry class, you're generally going to take it in an English department, aren't you? Whereas drama would be in the theater department. We've separated these out into two different things. For the ancient Greeks, drama is a type of poetry. You have tragic poetry and you have comedic poetry. And then you also have what were called satyr plays, which were basically slapstick and a lot of jokes about genitals and things that you're going to do with them and that sort of thing. We don't actually have much of that preserved, so we don't know enough about that sort of stuff. The Greeks didn't separate these things out the way that we did. And they also didn't have all of them at exactly the same time. What did they have first? Well, Nietzsche talks about two main poets, and he says that these are the two main currents in the history of Greek verse. He says, we may distinguish two main currents in the history of Greek verse according as language is used to imitate the world of appearance or that of music. And then later on, earlier on rather, he says that Homer and another guy who you're probably less familiar with, unless you're a classicist, Archilochus. He says, Homer and Archilochus side by side as ancestors and torchbearers of Greek poetry. Ancestors and torchbearers. So So they are the ones that are setting the pattern for everybody coming after them. Notice who he doesn't have there. He doesn't have Hesiod. Oftentimes when we think of the Greeks, we contrast Homer and somebody else who's very important in Greek thought, because he influenced a lot of other people. You see him being quoted quite often, say in Plato. Hesiod, who also did a lot with myth and with moral discussions and things like that. But instead, Nietzsche focuses on Homer and Archilochus. Why? Well, because Homer is the Apollonian artist par excellence, and Aeschylus is, in certain sense, the Dionysiac artist par excellence. They're ideal types as well as real people. So what does he say? He talks about Homer, and he calls him someone similar to a sculptor. Why? Well, they're devoted to contemplation. Of images. The sculptor contemplates in the work that he creates. He externalizes an image. A single image, too. Maybe two images together if it's, beside him, stealing somebody or something like that, somebody killing somebody else. Homer does it in verse. So he creates characters. The characters interact with each other. The characters are identifiable apart from each other. Each one has their own separate motives, their own history. They interact with each other. But Telemachus is somebody different from Odysseus, who is somebody different from the suitors, who Telemachus and Odysseus will later kill. The suitors who actually try to plan to kill Telemachus. Telemachus is different than Athena, who is taking on these different guises and coming and aiding him and aiding his father. Homer is telling stories that rely on lots of images. What else can we say about this? Well, the Homeric bard, and it's worth keeping in mind too, Homer doesn't just stand for one person. Homer is the culmination of a lot of different bards. This is what a lot of classicists think, whose words are being worked into a gigantic tapestry of verse in the two main works, and perhaps even in some of the minor works that are attributed to Homer as well. What do we know about this? Well, Nietzsche talks about this in terms of the Apollonian dream state. So again, we have dream versus intoxication. And he describes this really well. He says, this is the Apollonian dream state in which the daylight world is veiled. So the world that we're used to. Imagine people sitting around. Homer was not originally read, he was recited by rhapsodes. Later on, professionals by rhapsodes who interpret him. But originally, the Iliad and the Odyssey were spoken, were sang. It's kind of interesting too, because in the Odyssey, you have this famous, almost self-description of the bard singing in the halls of Odysseus about the sort of things that Homer himself would write about later on. And you have discussions by the different characters about the nature of a bard and what they're up to and what their value is. That's a little bit of a digression, but that also points to something kind of important, which is within a dream state, you can have dreams within dreams within dreams. If you look at the structure, say, of the Odyssey, you have stories being told within stories, sometimes within stories, right? Odysseus is in the story, and in the story he recounts the story of his travels to the people who are hosting him. And they have emotional responses to it. They weep at his misfortunes. All of this is within essentially a dream for us. Homer is introducing us to a dream, and it's one that's quite different from our everyday waking life. Sometimes people will read Homer and other, epic narratives like that, and they'll say, wow, the time of the Greeks must have been really something fantastic. They believed in all these gods and goddesses, and people were smiting each other and doing these great speeches and all that sort of stuff. That wasn't the everyday reality of the Greeks. Sometimes people read Plato and they're like, oh, the Greeks were so philosophical. They sat around and discussed all these sort of things all the time. They read the Symposium and they're like, man, sometimes they'll say, man, I wish I could have been back in the time of the Greeks and just sat around and drank wine and ate food and talked about philosophy with people. Or sometimes they say, holy crap, I wouldn't want to be in the time of the Greeks. They had to sit around and talk philosophy. There was nothing to do, no TV, Well, that was not the everyday reality for the Greeks either. Homer was taking people out of their everyday reality and putting them into what Nietzsche is calling the dream state in which the twilight world is veiled and a new world, clearer, more comprehensive, more affecting than the first, and at the same time more shadowy, falls upon the eye in ever-changing shapes. Epic poetry, epic literature in general, it doesn't just mimic a world, it creates a world. Now granted, some of this stuff is to us appears kind of just silly imaginary, when Odysseus and his men land on the shores of the lands of the Lotus Eaters. We read that sort of stuff, and that, we can try to do identifications. Yeah, those are like druggies of our time and stuff like that, but it seems a little, far-fetched. But that's not the point of epic poetry, according to Nietzsche at least. It's not to try to create some sort of world which then, is perfectly realistic and we all believe in. The way a lot of movies sometimes try to do. It's to give us a world that, like he said, is clearer, more comprehensive, more affecting than the first. A world that we're invited to, you might say, escape into. What about the Dionysiac artist? Now, Aeschylus is actually the Dionysiac artist par excellence for Nietzsche. And he talks about the lyric poet, right? He says, he is first and foremost a Dionysiac artist, become wholly identified with the original oneness, its pain and contradiction, producing a replica of that oneness as music, if music may legitimately seem to be as a repetition of the world. However, this music becomes visible to him again through the Apollonian dream sequence. There is still some Apollonian elements to him. What does he talk about? Well, Nietzsche talks about Aeschylus as, in particular, representing affects or emotions. He talks about him as being involved in an efflorescence of music and images and ideas. Images and ideas of what, though? Images and ideas of frantic love and contempt for women, right? Frantic love. Not just love, but frantic love. And at the very same time, contempt for the loved object, contempt for the loved person that remains inaccessible. Passionate loves and hates. Now, you do have passionate loves and hates in Homer, right? When Odysseus and his son are killing the suitors, they hate those guys. And there's reasons why they hate them. And the audience actually hates them too, because they're bad guys. They've been doing some terrible things, and they've been told not to do it a number of times. And then they had treated Odysseus, when he was a beggar, very poorly. as a result, right? But it's not the same thing to see the action happening at a distance and for somebody else to be saying, I love, I hate, I feel anger, I feel contempt, I feel joy, I am these emotions. That's what the lyric poet does. I love this particular phrase that Nietzsche uses. He talks about the entire chromatic scale of his passions and appetites when talking about Aeschylus and the lyric artist, the lyric poet in general. The entire chromatic scale. What is the chromatic scale? You know, we're used to the 7-tone scale. You know, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, or you know, however else you want to express it. It's done differently in different languages, right? That includes full steps and half steps. The chromatic scale just goes, it's a 12-tone scale, and it goes through the entire thing. The lyric artist represents, in these images that they're using, their raw emotions. Now Nietzsche has a really interesting digression here that I want to hit on very quickly, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but it is important. He talks about people of his time, and I think there's a temptation in our time, wanting to oppose somebody like Homer and then somebody like Aeschylus as the objective artist to the subjective artist. The subject is talking about himself. And Nietzsche says something really interesting here. He says, if that's the case, that's crap. That's not good art. It's not real art anyway. He doesn't say it in those terms, but I think, you know, we could express it like that. He says, the subjective artist is simply the bad artist. And, you know, I mean, if you've been in the art world, or if you have a son, daughter, roommate, nephew, niece, who is going to be a great artist, a great musician, great poet, any of these sorts of things, and you look at a lot of their early attempts at things, they're far too subjective. And, you know, in a way, I disagree with Nietzsche here. I think that one's own interior subjectivity could, in fact, be a good, fertile ground for doing good art. But you'd have to be old. You'd actually have to have lived through some stuff. Some 18-year-old kid, I don't care how much they've gone through, their love that's unrequited does not really have the same pathos as it will when they're 40 years old. There is something, the age does bring depth. So the artist who's just writing, who's just engaged in self-expression, just self-expression, is the bad artist. He says, we demand above all, in every genre and range of art, a triumph over subjectivity. Nietzsche, you know, one way of phrasing this, Nietzsche would say something like, I'm not interested in your BS. I don't want to hear about you and your pain individually as a single person. I want to know about the pain of the world. What it means to exist as a being in pain. I want something objective. Now, not objective in the sense of, like, you know, scientific objectivity, standing back from things. There's a type of objectivity here that's a little bit different. He says, what does this involve? Deliverance from the self, the silencing of every personal will and desire, including the desire to express oneself, to think that one's own emotions are somehow, you know, absolutely new, the most important thing in the world. You know, you could step back from your own, let's say you have an unhappy love affair, right? You're going to write a poem about it, and, you know, you're grieving and all that. And, you know, adolescents do this sort of thing all the time. Are you that important? I mean, you have these emotions. They exist. They're almost like musical notes. Just play the music. Don't insist that everybody else say that it's the best music in the world, this song has never ever been done before. Play the song well. If it turns out to be a song that somebody else has already done before, you can put your own spin on it, but don't put your own spin on it so much that it's identified as being this person's song. Play the song well, so that somebody else might actually want to hear it. So, to go back to this now, the Dionysiac lyric poet, what keeps them from just being subjective? Nietzsche thinks this has to do with identifying with the original oneness. Now, if we say that, it sounds kind of new agey, kind of hippy-dippy, kind of, there's other ways of doing this that aren't quite so low class intellectually. There's a long-standing tradition in Eastern literature, particularly in Hinduism, of identifying oneself with the primal oneness as well. Great amount of thought, very sophisticated thought has gone into that. Is Nietzsche meaning something like that? No. It's producing, here's where the key point is different. Nietzsche says that it's producing a replica of this oneness through music. How does music work? Do you play just one note all the time? And again, if we want to think of Eastern mysticism or philosophy or religion or something like that, you might actually compare this to a mantra or to the one single note, the that's supposed to go through all of existence. Nietzsche doesn't see music that way. Music is, going all over the place. There's melodies, there's rhythms, there's counterpoints. Like he says, the music produces an Apollonian reflection in images. And this image reveals to the artist his oneness. The Dionysiac artist identifies with these images, fuses with his characters, becomes the active center of the world. So hatred, or love, or anger, or fear, or whatever affect we're centering on, or whatever batch of affects we're centering on. And then the situations that are tied with them becomes identified with this primal oneness. One other thing that's worth talking about before we go on a little bit further, folk song. He talks about Aeschylus as introducing folk song back into poetry. And a lot of people tend to romanticize folk music in our day, and a lot of people tended to distrust folk music in the time of Nietzsche. It's very interesting because Nietzsche talks about folk music as a classical instance of a union between Apollonian and Dionysiac intentions. So there's a uniting there of Apollonian and Dionysiac elements. It's not just Dionysiac. He says the Dionysiac rules first, and that's through the melody. There's a melody first, and then you start finding words to fit it. And the words might be, about a feud, or about a crime, or about loving somebody, or about the milk being spoiled, or whatever you like. Provided you have a good melody for it, you have good music, then you can start finding images that actually work in well with that, and the two become fused together. He talks about language imitating the condition of music, and he talks about something that he calls a musical mirror of the cosmos. So, what does he mean by that? Does he mean that first the cosmos exists and then music tries to find some ways to replicate it, the way, say, sculpture or painting or things like that do? Or does he mean that it gets to something deeper? So here we touch on a really important idea for Nietzsche's works, not just this work, but for other ones, will. How does music actually manifest itself? Music manifests itself as will, he says, using the term in Schopenhauer's sense. So not just the will as a faculty that human beings have, like in Kant's sense, or even Thomas Aquinas' sense, or something like that. Will as hunger, striving, motivation, determination, underlying the cosmos. And he says, that is to say, is the opposite of the aesthetic, contemplative, unwilling disposition. For Schopenhauer, to appreciate art, to appreciate music, to adopt an aesthetic attitude meant to disengage one's own desires, one's own willings, one's own striving, all of that sort of stuff. And that's actually, that's why Schopenhauer thought that art could kind of save us from the absurd existence. So he says, at this point it becomes very necessary to discriminate clearly between essence and appearance. It's obviously impossible for music to represent the essential nature of the will. Music can't represent the essential nature of the will. For it did, we'd have to banish it from the realm of art altogether, saying as how the will is the non-aesthetic element par excellence. Rather, Nietzsche says, we should say that music appears as the will. In order to express that appearance through images, the lyrical poet must employ the whole register of emotions, from the whisper of love to the roar of frenzy. Moved by the urge to talk of music in the Apollonian similitudes, he must first comprehend the whole range of nature, including himself as the eternal source of volition, desire, appetite. So, what's going on? The artist is actually expressing or bringing to appearance not just intellect, not just perception, but will, something that makes us most what we are. Okay, so all that said, that sets the ground for figuring out what is tragedy? What's going on? What is the function, Nietzsche says, of the chorus? If you read Greek tragedy, you notice that it's not like a lot of contemporary plays where you just have characters and dialogue. You have a chorus, and then you have characters. And they're all on the stage, right? We're used to thinking of choruses in terms of churches and choral works and performances and things like that. We're not used to thinking of choruses in terms of a bunch of people involved but not in a major way in the actual play. But that's the way Greek tragedy works. Greek comedy actually worked like that as well. The chorus takes on different appearances. You know, in one of Aristophanes' plays, it's a bunch of frogs, a play called The Frogs, right? The chorus may be a bunch of old men, as I believe, if I remember right, it is in Agamemnon. But why do you have something like that? Nietzsche says this is really important to get down, because if we want to think about the origin of tragedy, where did it come from? All the traditions tell us that the beginning of tragedy was actually with a chorus. The characters came later. They were introduced one at a time, and then, you know, two characters, and then a bunch of characters. And actually still, a lot of the drama happens off camera, as it were, off the stage, you know, reported in the discourse of the chorus or the characters. So what's actually going on? Nietzsche says there's 3 misguided viewpoints that were common at his time. And I think these are maybe still a little bit common. Probably the first one is more common. So why do we have a chorus? Well, one explanation is it's an expression of democracy. You know, it's the populace against what he calls the noble realm of the set, the characters. So the chorus is the ordinary people, and the ordinary people are in some ways smarter than the characters who tend to get themselves in trouble and bring about terrible, you know, things that shock and horrify and you know, sometimes amuse. There is comedy in tragedy, actually. They produce different reactions in us. The chorus are the ones who are saying, oh, wait, don't do that. You're going too far with that. Maybe that's the representative of democracy. Another one is, the chorus is the ideal spectator. We'll get into that in a moment. The third, which is particularly interesting, is that the chorus is a living wall against reality. So, something that allows the maintenance of the willing suspension of disbelief, is often talked about. So let's look at this. The first one. Nietzsche says, this interpretation, which sounds so grandly edifying to certain politicians, as though the democratic Athenians had represented in the popular chorus the invariable moral law, always right in the face of the passionate misdeeds and extravagances of kings, may have been suggested by a phrase in Aristotle, but this lofty notion can have had no influence whatever on the original formation of tragedy. Why? Where did tragedy come from? Did it come from democratic politics or anything like that? Not at all. It came from communal rights. It came from Greek religion. Its purely religious origins would exclude not only the opposition between the people and their rulers, but any kind of political or social context. So that's not going to work. That's sort of a modern, anachronistic way of misreading what's going on in Greek tragedy. What about the idea of the ideal spectator? Now Nietzsche gets in a dig. He says, well, Germans, they love anything that's called ideal. But let's put that aside for a moment. Let's say maybe there's something to this. What would the ideal spectator be? It's the spectator that's needed in order to make the work be a work of art. And he says, we're amazed when we compare a familiar theater audience with a tragic chorus and ask ourselves whether the former could conceivably be construed into something analogous to the latter. Why? Well, what would an ideal spectator look like? An ideal spectator would, first of all, sit down and shut up, right? If you're a spectator, I mean, what is it that people hate at the movies, right? It's other people commenting on the movie, saying, don't go in there, or, making all sorts of other commentary, because if you're a spectator, if that's really what your role is, your job is to spectate, to watch, to maybe learn, but essentially to keep from interfering with other people's enjoyment of it. Like he says, another thing, we had supposed all along the spectator would always have to remain conscious of the fact he had to form a work of art, not empiric reality. If you're an ideal spectator, and this is a purely aesthetic thing, then you know that you have before you something which is not real, rather than reality itself. Does that make sense for the Greek chorus? No, because the Greek chorus actually reacts. They are part of the, not necessarily part of the action, but part of the scene. They're in it. They see what's going on with the characters, and they think that that is real stuff. So this ideal spectator thing doesn't really work. What about the living wall idea? Well, like I said, Schiller used this view as his main weapon against commonplace naturalism. Schiller's the guy who comes up with this living wall idea. Against the illusionistic demand made on dramatic poetry. While the day of the stage was considered to be artificial, the architecture of the set symbolic, the metrical discourse stylized, a larger misconception still prevailed. Schiller was not content to have what constitutes the very essence of poetry merely tolerated as poetic license. He insisted that the introduction of the chorus was the decisive step by which any naturalism in art was openly challenged. Naturalism in art, meaning art ought to imitate the everyday reality that we see. So, you know, you should have a lot of good props on stage that look exactly like the real things that we see. People should talk like ordinary people and like people do in the world, not in these sort of artificial tones that are common, especially in Greek tragedy. Now Nietzsche says, you know, as far as that's being arranged, that's wrong. Because again, the chorus is not a living wall in that sense. He says the world of tragedy is by no means a world arbitrarily projected between heaven and earth. Rather, it is a world having the same reality and credibility as Olympus possessed for the devout Greek. Is there a sense in which some of these are true, though? This expression of democracy, okay, Nietzsche says that's not true at all. But these other two are, actually. Without Schlegel and Schiller actually knowing what they're about. The chorus is, in a certain way, the ideal spectator. How is the chorus, in a certain way, the ideal spectator? Well, the chorus is an ideal spectator not by standing back, not by being the perfect spectator, but by being involved. The chorus helps the audience in Greek tragedy to become part of the spectacle itself, so that the division between stage and seats disappears, and everybody is invited to become portion of the drama that is taking place, to feel, to react, to be struck, to learn, to wish one hadn't learned. So the chorus is an ideal spectator, but ideal in a different way. They're the leading spectators. They are also a living wall, but they're not a living wall, Nietzsche says, against the everyday reality. They're a living wall against the reality that we were talking about earlier. Existence itself, being itself, life itself. They allow a certain consolation, in part, and this is where we're going to come to the Apollonian portion of this, by helping, by birthing the images, the Apollonian part, the images bound up in characters to come to life. So that one doesn't just dwell on the fact that we're all going to die and none of it's going to have any meaning. It does have meaning for this character in this place, or these characters together in this place. Not a perfect universal meaning that gives, sense to everything. No one single tragedy is the whole of existence, or humanity writ large. But each one is a sort of partial look into how life might look, how one might configure oneself in relation to that. So the chorus is the living wall. And this happens through identification. Identification with the characters who are an Apollonian element, but the identification part is Dionysiac. Nietzsche says, who is the character on stage? It is Dionysus. So in Agamemnon is Dionysus. Clytemnestra is Dionysus. Aegisthus is Dionysus. In a way, it's when Agamemnon comes, well, and so is, I'm blanking on her name, the Cassandra, the slave from Troy who sees what's going to happen. Each one of them is Dionysus. Each one of them is life, is reality, embodied in a particular form, through metaphor, condensed that way. So, like he says, what is Greek tragedy then? Greek tragedy is a Dionysiac chorus which again and again discharges itself in Apollonian images. And he says it's an Apollonian embodiment of Dionysiac insights and powers. He says that the chorus is actually the matrix of the tragedy. The chorus is the substratum of the tragedy. The characters are kind of floating on top of it. That's a really interesting way of reading Greek tragedy. I would like sometime, this is a digression on my part, but I would like sometime to actually sit down and go back through all of these Greek plays and just read the chorus parts, and then just read the chorus and the characters together and see the characters as essentially responding to the chorus rather than as driving the play as we think they do. When we read it, we often don't pay attention to the chorus. We skim over that to get to what is Oedipus saying? What is Agamemnon saying? What is Medea saying? Dionysius was not actually present but merely imagined. Later, an attempt is made to demonstrate the god as real and to bring the visionary figure together with the transfiguring frame vividly before the eyes of each spectator. This marks the beginning of drama in the strict sense of the word. It then became the task of the dithyrambic chorus so to excite the mood of the listeners that when the tragic hero appeared, they would behold not the awkwardly masked man, but a figure born of their own rapt vision. Their powers of imagination would be evoked, but only if they listened to the chorus, only if they allowed the chorus's lines to penetrate into their souls. And he's got this great example from Greek tragedy. Interestingly enough, from a tragedy from somebody who he didn't like, from Euripides on Magus. And I'll leave that for you to look up. A splitting takes place between two different completely separate spheres of expression, like he says. Everything that rises to the surface in the Apollonian portion of Greek tragedy in the dialogue looks simple, transparent, beautiful. In this sense, the dialogue is a mirror of the Greek mind whose nature manifests itself in dance. The language of the Sophoclean heroes surprises us by its Apollonian determinacy and lucidity. It seems to us that we can fathom their innermost being, and we are somewhat surprised that we had such a short way to go. However, once we abstract from the character of a hero as it rises to the surface and becomes visible, its appearance, and instead penetrate into the myth, the story, which is projected in these luminous reflections, we come up against a phenomenon which is the exact opposite of the familiar optical one. So, what is he talking about there? What is going on in myth? This gets us to a really important point of not only tragedy, but also Nietzsche's approach to life. And he says, if we look at Sophocles and we look at Aeschylus, Aeschylus, remember, is coming before Sophocles. So he's beginning with Sophocles and he's tracing his way back. What is the one single character or play of Sophocles that people remember the most? Oedipus. And what did Oedipus do? Well, he killed his father and slept with his mother. That's why we have, the Oedipus complex and all that. Well, no. That's not all that happened there. Oedipus, to begin with, starts out, being cursed by a prophecy, which leads to him having his feet or ankles pierced and being cast out to be killed by his father and presumably mother, being adopted, believing that he's going to actually escape the prophecy, thinking that his adopted parents are the real parents, coming back to his native land, which is being essentially besieged and wasted by the Sphinx, answering the riddle of the Sphinx, coming across his father without recognizing him, engaging in battle with him, killing him, coming to the city, finding out that the king has been killed, not realizing that he's the one who killed the king, and as a very typical strong man, marrying the queen and begetting children with her, not realizing that it's his own mother, and then doing the right thing, launching an investigation into who actually killed the king, only to find out that it was him. What is Nietzsche getting out of this? Like he says, the Sophoclean hero, Oedipus, is a problem of different ethics, different valuations. He says, "The profound poet tells us that a man who is truly noble is incapable of sin, though every law, every natural order, indeed the entire canon of ethics perish by his actions. Those very actions will create a circle of higher consequences, able to found a new world on the ruins of the old." That's essentially what Oedipus is trying to do without realizing it. But it doesn't work, because reality is bigger and stronger than any one single character. No character in Greek tragedy is able to make the world become his own subject, to take over everything. What does Aeschylus tell us? Well, one of the great stories of Aeschylus is the story of Prometheus. What does Prometheus do? He steals fire for humanity and comes into conflict with Zeus as a result. What does the Prometheus myth to actually tell us? Nietzsche says, "The original philosophical problem poses at once an insoluble conflict between men and the gods, which lies like a huge boulder at the gateway in every culture. Man's highest good must be bought with a crime, and paid for by the flood of grief and suffering which the offended divinities visit on the human race in its noble ambition." He contrasts this original crime with the Semitic myth of the original fall, right? A myth that he says exhibits curiosity, deception, suggestibility, concupiscence as the root of all evil. What distinguishes the Aryan conception is an exalted notion of active sin as the properly Promethean virtue. This notion provides us with what he calls the ethical substratum of pessimistic tragedy. The tragedy at the heart of things, the contrariety at the center of the universe, is seen by Aeschylus and by Nietzsche as an interpenetration of several worlds. As, for instance, a divine and a human. Here's where it gets really interesting. Each individually in the right, but each as it encroaches on the other, having to suffer for its individuality. So you might say, multiple ethics, multiple systems of right and wrong, multiple laws, natural, divine, human, running into each other. And here's where the tragedy results. They're all right, but they can't all be compatible. And somebody has to suffer. Probably both sides suffering, as a matter of fact. The individual, in the course of his heroic striving towards universality, de-individuation, comes up against that primordial contradiction and learns both to sin, that's the active part, and to suffer, that's the passive, affective part. This is at the center of the interplay with the characters. This is what the chorus is whipping up the audience to be able to endure and counter through their identification with the characters. The characters are not all expressing the same point of view. The characters are coming into conflict. And they're not coming into conflict just as single individuals. They're coming into conflict as representatives of, like he says, these several worlds, each individually in the right, but each as it encroaches on the other, having to suffer for its individuality. This, Nietzsche thinks, is of the essence of tragedy. This is how the chorus functions as a living wall against the abyss, against the nihilistic void of meaning to existence. It shows the conflict that's occurring at the heart of things, particular conflicts. This is how the chorus is the ideal spectator. This is also why it cannot be an expression of democracy, because there's nothing crowd-like about this. There is no idealistic resolution of everything in everybody getting to vote and everybody getting along in Greek tragedy. Now, what is Greek tragedy doing? It's actually reworking Greek myth. This way it prevents what he calls an Apollonian sterilization. One way to deal with these, separate worlds coming into conflict and running into each other, bruising each other, facing off, maybe absorbing each other, would be to just set up a bunch of, lines. Okay, you get this area, you get this area, you get this area, you get this area. Like what encyclopedia articles do with the Greek mythos. Neptune is the god of the sea. Hades is the god of the underworld. Zeus is the king of the gods. Hera is the queen and goddess of motherhood and childbirth. Demeter is the goddess of grain. And it sounds like everything's got its nice place. And well, okay, I have this sort of problem, go over here and pray to this god over here. I got this sort of problem, go pray to this. But really, the compartments get they permeate each other, they get very messy, and you see them coming into conflict and clashing with each other. If you had like a perfect, not in a Nietzschean sense of perfect, but in another sense, if you had a perfect sort of systemization of this, where everybody's got their place, it would be very sterile. It would be, in a lot of ways, anti-life. It would be dead. There'd be no growth. It wouldn't be real. Be like a mausoleum. Nietzsche thinks of this as what Egyptian religion became. Homeric myth is transformed through tragedy. And the power of music is keeping myth from just rigidifying into orthodoxy, into a kind of prehistory. Where I'm going to leave off here, we've talked about two important tragic playwrights, Aeschylus and Sophocles. Nietzsche's going to end section 10 by complaining about something that's happening, and he's tying it in with a particular guy. He says, "What were you thinking of, overweening Euripides, when you hoped to press myth, then in its last agony, into your service? It died under your violent hands, but you could easily put in its place an imitation that would trick itself out in the master's robes."